2, 1,
go. No. I'm excited to do this, man.
Finally doing it. It's only been, what, like 6 months?
We've known each other for a little bit of time. We met in New York.
We met in New York when you were doing the podcast with Sam.
Yes. Did a podcast with Sam. Shout out Sam. And then I think my biggest thing was I was super surprised you lived in Miami.
Okay.
I don't know. I think I don't know what I expected when I moved to Miami, but I've met a lot of cool people, and it's been awesome hanging out.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how much fun it's been. But yeah, it's funny. What were we doing? We were at the penthouse in New York for like the token launch party or something.
For Sam.
For Sam, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And I was like, huh. I remember we were at the bar getting drinks. Yeah. And she was like, what do you want? And I was like, I have no idea what I want. Just like, give me something. And then you made some sort of snarky comment. And I was like, who are you? Like, I'm Logan. Who are you? I'm like, I'm Omar, I guess. And then we just started talking. No, and 30 seconds later, we're talking about like hardware and parallelization. And he were like, wait, who are you again? I was like, wait, who are you again? So.
No, it was good. Thank you. I am excited to do this. I think you'll share some spicy takes and let the world know who you are. But maybe we could just start off with like who you are, what you do, and how you got to this point.
Okay. I'm not sure where to start. So I'm Omar Yehia. That's how you pronounce my name. That's actually my first name. It's Omar, but anyway. And I spent a lot of time outside of crypto when I was in academia, and I was very interested in like a lot of very esoteric topics. More on the applied math side and the applied physics side. Nothing to do with cryptography. Nothing to do with finance or economics. Just to do with I was infatuated by how the world works, and more importantly, I was really interested in like how you model and how you interpret the way things are. Mm-hmm. And when I was younger, I had this almost this like crazy hypothesis that like everything could be like quantified, and you can write down an equation that explained everything, and it was just a matter of like finding that equation. And if you look at like the history and like the pursuit of science, it was a lot like that. It was a lot of just very crazy, very ambitious people that thought like, if only I was smarter as a person or as a scientist, I could just write down an equation that would describe these things. And at first I thought, surely we could do this for the material world. So surely I could do this to describe like the moon and the sun and the stars and the ocean and things like that. And humanity's made a lot of progress. And so that I thought was very inspiring. But then I thought, okay, what is sort of missing? And when I was younger, I was really interested in like human behavior. Could you like write down simple mathematical equations that model human behavior? And I would sort of like do this. I would, especially in college, I would like go out with people and I would like run these little like experiments of mine, or like I would meet someone and I would like try and do the scientific method on that person. I'd be like, who is that guy? And what's my hypothesis as to like what makes him tick, or makes sometimes with girls, what made them tick? And then I would go back home and I would sort of like on these little index cards, I swear this is a real story, I would like try and like mathematically model that person and like think from like a game theory perspective, how is this guy or girl, how are they inclined to behave? And this was very amateur, but it was stuff that I was learning about at the time. This was when I started uni, and I was always fascinated by that idea. And I as I've gotten older, I think I've become a little bit disillusioned with the idea, not because I don't fundamentally think that we live in a material world and everything can be quantified, but it's because it's really, really hard. And like prediction, I've learned you have to really take with a grain of salt, and it is extraordinarily difficult just because of the sheer number of parameters that govern like the way anything behaves. In a very reduced setting, we can model things. And I think science is not the rule, it's actually the exception. Only in the scientific world can you isolate physical phenomenon, and you can write down a simple set of governing equations that actually faithfully describe the way the system works. And you can go and you can replicate these experiments and you can test your hypotheses. This in no way is in the purview of like the social sciences. When we talk about like human behavior, that's fundamentally why I don't think it's like plausible to think the way I used to think. Because you cannot have a simple Platonic like experiment. People call this like the ludic fallacy. This idea that the world conforms to very, very simple models. Only a very, very small corner of the world sort of behaves like that. And that we call the physical and the material world and like physics. That's sort of what we're interested in. Everything else to do with human behavior, I don't know. I just throw my hands up. I don't know.
So that was more your youth, but then, or in like your undergrad, but then you kept doing additional school and decided to continue your studies at Princeton and do
That's
your
right.
PhD.
That's right.
Maybe touch upon like what you did there and some of your like further learnings.
Sure. So I'll tell you how I even ended up there. Starting from my second year in uni, I got really interested in like research. I would go to lectures sometimes, and I would sit down, and I'd realize like the lecture was, however nice they may be, they were still just telling me about what was in the book. So I said, okay, I mean, it's probably easier if I just go back home and read the textbook. And that's pretty much what I did for like 4 years. So I said, okay, this is fine. It's probably not like a best use of my time. I should probably do something else. And so I would like walk around the departments, and I would like bother people and ask them like what it is that you're doing. Like you seem important. You have assistants and like secretaries and like students running around. Like surely you do something important. Can I just like follow you around? And they would let me in their labs. They would. At some point they paid me, which I thought was ridiculous because like what the hell do I know about any of this stuff? And they would pay me to like help them like do research. And like at some point as a research assistant, I got promoted to like a research student or whatever. And I worked in like I must have done research in like 3 or 4 different departments, like the electrical engineering department, the applied physics department, the aerospace engineering department. I was just so fascinated by what people were studying, and a lot of it came down to I was really interested in like propulsion and like and rocket science is the sort of common term that people use. And I was like, why not? I mean, where I grew up, this was not something that like we had access to. I grew up in Egypt, and it's just not a thing. I'd never even seen a rocket sort of in person, but when I came to the United States, you could go see these things like casually. So I was like, this seems like worthy. It's a very curious topic and worthy of pursuit. And so I did that for a while, and that's when I really got into like propulsion, and that led me to think about like the mathematics behind propulsion, and it got me into like studying fluid mechanics and chemistry and all of these sort of wonderful topics. And funny enough, at some point there was not enough. I was hassling the departments to like teach me about or like allow me to sit in on these courses, and they're like, we don't have any courses that like fit the Venn diagram of your interests. And so what they did, which I thought was really hilarious, they let me come up with my own class. I literally went to the registrars department, true story, and they made me fill out a form, and like as long as someone was willing to sign off on it, some of the faculty members were willing to sign off on it, I could actually make my own course, and I could assign credits, and like they give me a grade on it, and it was fantastic. And the first comment they had was, the name you chose was too long. It has to fit into like 40 characters or whatever. I mean, I came up with something. I was like, who gets to pick their own class? I'm just going to make a fancy class. And that was, I studied with this brilliant professor at electrical engineering department. His name was Peter Bammel. And he told me, hey, I wonder if we could capture a lot of the waste energy that leaves a lot of mechanical systems or thermodynamic systems. And I wonder if we could like mathematically design like an optical system that does this. And I said, these all sound like great ideas, but I don't know how to do them. He said, well, just come into the lab and like we'll for a semester, this will be your course. And so he said, come up with a name for it. As I just called it like thermophotovoltaics or something, which all that means is that you use like PV cells, that's what the photovoltaics are, to capture the sort of wasted heat. And we spent a lot of time writing these solvers that would like in 3 dimensions allow you to predict how these systems would behave. And that's when I learned all about Maxwell's equations, and we can perhaps some of the most interesting equations in all of physics are Maxwell's equations, and the only reason is because they so accurately describe everyday phenomenon, but they're linear. they're linear equations, which means they're, in like layman's terms, they're very, very simple to write down the solutions to. And they hold in like a variety of different conditions, which is a very, very odd thing. And it's very rare in physics. But they're named after this fella. I think he was a Scotsman, James Clerk Maxwell, who's sort of the father of the theory of electricity and magnetism. And one of his great insights was that like electricity and magnetism are sort of two sides of the same coin. But anyway, I studied that for a long time, and then at some point I realized I was really interested in this idea of like research. You can actually sit at the frontier of what people know and what they don't know, and then maybe you can make a contribution. So after that, I spent some time, like I said before, studying like rocket propulsion. And at my university, we had this one very esoteric laboratory that was actually founded as part of the Apollo program in America, the program that sent man to the moon. And so they had these monstrous facilities that you could literally have like a proper rocket engine there, not like a full scale one, but one that was big enough to like blow your head off. And we would study these systems, and again, I sort of think about like the kind of mathematical systems that you need to write down to be explain the behavior of these things. And at some point, I ran out of time. They're like, you have to graduate now. You have to leave. And I was like, well, can I stay? And they're like, you can stay, but you've been here long enough. You should probably go somewhere else. And I said, well, fair enough. Who's willing to take me? So I remember just emailing the faculty at Princeton and just telling them, hey, this is sort of what I do. And like, I looked you guys up, and it's clear that you guys are brilliant. And I've sort of learned a thing or two where I was, and I kind of want to continue to learn some more. And they were like, come on down. And I was like, okay, easy enough. And then they said, oh, we did this sort of PhD program where you have to sort of learn these sort of things, and then you can teach a little bit, and then you have to do some sort of original scientific research, and that's it. I said, okay, that sounds fun, fun enough. But funny enough, probably after I went, and part of the reason I went, and this is true, it was personal. Some of my heroes growing up were sort of Alan Turing, Dick Feynman, who was a physicist. I think he won the Nobel Prize in 1965. John Nash. All of these people, they went to the graduate college in Princeton, which is where I actually stayed as a first year. And the first thing I did when I arrived was just like look for their rooms, and I actually ended up staying in Alan Turing's room.
Really?
Yeah.
That's it.
I'm sure the father of the modern computer, the Turing machine. When we talk about at some point, maybe we'll talk about like Turing complete languages. Yeah, it's the same person, Alan Turing. In the graduate college, I remember, and I was just so infatuated by the idea that you could walk in these giants' footsteps.
He went to Princeton?
He went to Princeton for graduate school. I believe he went to Cambridge for his undergraduate, but he did his PhD at Princeton.
That's cool.
Right before the war. Yeah. And so did Dick Feynman. In fact, Dick Feynman in I think it was 1939, 1940. He left. He was the only person to take the trains from Princeton to Los Alamos in New Mexico, and because the War Department at the time didn't want people to like realize what was going on, they told everyone, hey, make sure all the scientists from Princeton or like in New York, like Columbia, don't leave from the same stations because it would look suspicious. So Feynman, being Feynman, said, assuming everybody else does that, I could just leave for Princeton, right? And so he walks up to the train station, and then the guy at the ticketing booth says like, oh, so all of this stuff is for you, because all of the lab equipment and all of the chairs and desks and all of the stuff that was leaving Princeton for everyone, the entire faculty, was just assigned to one guy. And so he was like, oh, that's you. And that was very sort of quintessential Feynman. But he left actually before even he finished. So he had to come back after the war effort to just wrap his stuff up, and then go on to be a faculty. I think he started at Cornell. That was probably the peak of my like infatuation with the idea that I can spend my entire life just working on like scientific problems. And it appeared to me that that's what these people did. That's what Paul Feynman, Richard Feynman, Paul Dirac, Isidore Rabi, these guys. It appeared to me that that's what they did. But then I realized that maybe that's not the world that we live in today. The way in which like academic research was funded back then, the way in which people chose which topics to study, the way in which advisors chose the students that they had, all of these things were materially different than we are today. And today I would say it's much more industrialized. And I just, at some point, it didn't occur to me that the way I saw academic research being done around the world, it didn't occur to me that maybe that's what I'd be doing for the rest of my life. And but who knows? I was young. I still am young now, but at the time, I didn't know what to do. So I started asking myself, so what is it that I like? What is it about this academic stuff that I really liked and really enjoyed? And I realized there was probably a handful of things that really, really made me excited, but they weren't monopolized by academia at all. And these things were like this idea that I could collaborate with people all over the world. We can work together on these very difficult problems, and almost like in secrecy, and in secrecy not because we protected it, but it's because nobody else knew what we were doing because just it was a very niche topic, or it was an uninteresting topic to most. So there's almost like this band of people working together on these problems. And the question became like, well, could I find this somewhere else? And so, and could there be more money at stake? Or could there be more, could there be an incentive beyond just intellectual curiosity, which I think for many things is enough, but it certainly does not align the incentives of a lot of people. And so that's when I stumbled upon venture.
That's pretty wild. But so you're very heavily in academia, you're doing all your studies, and ultimately stumbled upon venture. And then that took you to Arrington Capital.
Right. That's right.
And you were head of research for them?
We had over there, it was a vehicle that we did venture from and liquid trading. So there was like a variety of different functions at the fund. There was somebody was looking at ecosystems, somebody was looking at liquid trading, somebody was looking at venture, somebody was looking at fund operations and stuff. My part was research and due diligence. I was this was part of the reason I joined, and certainly the part that kept me very interested was this idea that like I could work on the technical aspects, whether it was just coming up with theses, whether it was thinking about the investments, whether it was doing due diligence, which was something that really interested me, on the actual investments. So this idea that somebody's coming to you and saying, here's my proposition, here's the business model, and here is sort of a sketch of the architecture of how this technically could function. And I could just look at it and think, wow, this is interesting. There might be promise there. Or, this might not be the best idea. Or this it might sound good on paper, but when you come to implement these things, they might not be like technically feasible. And I found great pleasure in that, not because I like to, fund things, but it was because I just thought that's interesting. And you're responsible for allocating people's capital. And so at the end of the day, you have to be completely and utterly aware of your circle of competence, what it is that you understand and what it is that you don't understand. And what you do understand, you try and allocate capital to in a way that's like prudent and like try and do like investments that make sense to you and that you can justify later. And the stuff that you don't know anything about, you just stay away from. And having no opinion is perfectly okay. I have no opinion on most things, but I don't invest in most things. I only invest in a small subset of things.
Yeah. So I think that's a very interesting transition. One, going into venture, but then also just like pivoting into crypto. So could you talk, you kind of touched upon the venture part, but could you also touch upon like why crypto?
Why crypto? So this is a very funny personal story, but I suspect it's how lots of people that are not from the US, I suspect it's how they get interested in crypto. I got rugged. I got straight up rugged. The Egyptian Central Bank in 2016 decided to lock capital. So inhibit the flow of capital outside of the US, and then remove the peg from the currency, which was pegged for quite some time, and into a floating exchange rate. And they straight up locked up the capital in the banks. You couldn't take dollars out. You could only keep them in local currency, and they rugged us. And this was 2016. So I was like, man's been to the moon. We have vaccines. We have all of these sort of things. How is it that we haven't figured out this problem of money? How is it that we can't I just don't have a vehicle by which after I've worked and after I've earned some amount of assets or capital or accumulated them, whatever, how is it that I can't store it somewhere? How ridiculous is that? And so I just thought that's at the time I got attracted to the Austrian School of Economics, the literature of the Austrian school. And then they started talking about of course you can store it in gold. And I said, nah, that doesn't seem like a great idea. Just seems a bit antiquated. Surely there is a better way. And so that's when I really got into like cryptographically private money, secure private money. This idea that you can have a shared ledger and everyone can like attest this is how much money you have, and everybody can see it and nobody can touch it unless they have your private key or your seed phrase. So to that I thought was fascinating. I said, great. So let me sort of try and like buy this stuff. And so I got into Bitcoin. And so I remember this was I was at Princeton at the time, and there was a vibrant community in the cryptocurrency space then. It wasn't called Web3 then; it was just crypto.
Yeah.
So somebody had pointed me to the white paper. They said you should probably go read the Bitcoin white paper. I was like, okay. So I read the Bitcoin white paper, and I was like, this sort of makes sense. There's a lot of like mathematical ambiguity. Like I knew this could not be it. I knew the person who had actually like written the white paper and the person who like wrote the implementation of it, they had to be at least different people, or at least like of different mindsets. Because just all alone, if you actually go back and try and replicate that paper, there's a bunch of like different mathematical mistakes in that paper. So it's not enough. I was sure that like I was just missing something. Surely there was more to it than that. And I talked to someone who I respected a lot and who was much smarter than I am. He said, yeah, but it works fine. And I said, okay, fair enough. So I'm just that was my little due diligence. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go buy some. And then I remember it was a weekend. It was a Saturday. I said, okay. So I remember I allocated some capital to it. And I came back the next weekend. And I was like, well, now what? Now that I bought this coin, what do I do with it? And I went back to the same person and I asked him, now what? And he just sort of, he was very cheeky and looked at me. He said, so have you heard of Ethereum? And so I said, no. And then he pointed me to, I think it was the Ethereum yellow paper at the time. I was like, now we're talking. That was the one written by Gavin Wood. And if you read that paper, you're like, okay. So some deep thought has gone into how we go from just like moving like coins around to like having like a decentralized public state transition machine. And I was like, okay, now we're talking. So that's sort of my light bulb moment.
Huh. It's super interesting. Yeah, the money aspect does suck. It's super interesting that, even now, like in Turkey, I think recently with inflation, like the last couple of weeks, it's been reported like they have like 70% inflation, which is insane. Nice. But I think the now what question is super interesting because you buy Bitcoin and then you're like, okay, what else do I do?
Yeah. What else? I realized only because like, when you have money in your checking account, you use it for a lot of different things. You use it for payments, you use it to pay your rent, you use it to whatever. You use it to put in your investment account. Like there's a bunch of stuff that you do with it. But it occurred to me as soon as I put it in my wallet and I was like, there's nothing else to do with it. So I just thought it was odd. And this is from a very naive perspective. I was like, there's literally nothing else to do.
So now that you have a little bit more nuanced opinions, what is your point of view on Bitcoin?
What do I do with it?
Do you think it's a good store of wealth, or do you think ultimately like something else like Ethereum, Solana, or any of these other smart contract platforms will serve a better purpose for kind of like store of wealth or medium of exchange?
Okay. Well, I'll say a few things about that. First, when you have a store of value, it doesn't have to be exclusive. There can be multiple ways for one to store value. So to say that Bitcoin is a good store of value does not negate that other things could also be good stores of value. And I do think Bitcoin can be a good store of value. There is enough people and it is a good store of value, not because of anything technical and not because of anything related to the code. And this is something that I find strange that people continue to like propagate. It has everything to do with social consensus.
Yeah.
It is the same reason why gold stores its value very well. It's the same reason why some currencies store their value better relative to other currencies. Most of them don't on an absolute scale, on a purchasing power scale. It's because of social consensus. Enough people have bought into in a voluntary way, in a voluntary sense, carry this idea that this can be a store of value, that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's not a bad thing. That's fine. But the only thing to remember there is that it has nothing to do with the code. It has nothing to do with the fact that enshrined in it somewhere is the fact that there is a fixed supply, because with social consensus, you can change the fixed supply. It's not a big deal. In fact, you make it deflationary if you wanted to. Everything about it can change if enough people want it to change. And I'll steal a quote from Sriram, who was on your last podcast. He said something like quite profound. He said the most fundamental property, the defining property of any public ledger is open state. Mm-hmm. This idea that if enough people look at the ledger and decide there's one agent doing something that we're not happy about, they can just fork the chain and they can move on with their lives. And in the same way, if enough people realize that we like this idea of Bitcoin, but something about it doesn't appeal to us, maybe it's the fixed supply, maybe it's the consensus model, whatever. If enough people are interested, they will just fork the chain and they will move on.
Yeah.
So it has everything to do with social consensus and very little to do with what actually the Bitcoin core software does.
No, I like it. It's Bitcoin kind of is the gateway, but I do think like it gets a lot more interesting as you start looking at the Turing complete blockchains, the smart contracts, and start kind of like getting people to actually use the stuff.
Yeah. And to be fair, because we don't want to like lean on, I mean, there's been a lot of work on the Bitcoin core software development and people building around it. And there are environments of people who think it is interesting to develop smart contract like capability on Bitcoin. I just think it's almost like a contradiction to the ethos of Bitcoin. The reason why, or a technical reason why it can work well as a store of value is because of the ossification it's achieved. In terms of like, this is what it is. It's not going to change. It only does one thing and it does it very well and it's very decentralized and it's very secure. So that's it. That's it. And if you're happy with that, then I find it slightly contradictory to say, but we can also do other things.
Yeah.
Well, you sort of you can, but then you undermine the sort of ethos that you had to begin with. So
I agree.
Yeah.
Bitcoin's funny. But anyways, no, I think it's just a super interesting story going from, kind of your beginning studies, trying to model everything and everybody, to kind of doing more research driven with the PhD at Princeton and getting into venture. I'm always fascinated by people's journeys because it's like, I think always like looking back, like everything kind of seems easy-ish, but like at the time and like making the decisions that you do, it's not like straightforward and like it's very hard to kind of navigate the waters and to, end up where you are. So I find people's journeys fascinating.
I'll be completely honest with you. I had no idea what I was doing. I continue to have no idea what I'm doing, and to even like pretend that there was any sort of lineage that I was trying to do, it's completely ridiculous. When I was an undergraduate, I had no idea what I wanted to do after. When I was in graduate school, I had no idea what I wanted to do after. I had like, if you had asked me 2 years in, when I was in graduate school, like in 2 or 3 years or whatever, you'll have your venture fund and you'll be deploying capital and you'll be working. I would have called it completely ludicrous. It was so outside of the scope of my thinking. So. And I think that's actually like the hallmark of growth. The hallmark of growth is that you end up on a trajectory that's completely unanticipated and so interesting that you think back and you look like, wow, how on earth did I get here?
I fully agree.
Yeah.
No, I definitely agree. Well, maybe kind of jumping off from there, you were at this previous venture fund and now you have your own venture fund.
That's right.
Maybe talk about that and then kind of like some things that you're doing at your venture fund compared to say like other venture funds, because one thing that I very much appreciate about you is your technical background and your technical capabilities. And I've been very surprised by other venture capitalists in the space, or even like the space, like in large part of how non-technical people really are that are investing in this space. And so maybe just kind of touching upon like what you're doing and kind of like your interactions with other investors in the space.
Sure. So I'm the managing partner of a fund called Prudentia Digital, and Prudentia is just the Latin word for prudence, and it's one of our guiding philosophies. We think we've seen enough like investments in the space where because of the lack of prudence, things sort of went sour. And I've always thought it was an odd idea. Especially, it's one thing if you're deploying your own funds. This is a free country; you can do whatever you want. I mean, if you want to, be a complete degenerate and just like blow it, it's completely your prerogative. I have nothing to say about that. People should they should be able to do whatever you want. But the second you raise capital, and the second people entrust you with their capital, you have a duty to them. And the first duty you have to them is the duty of prudence. You have to take care of their capital as if it were your own. And you have to study every prospective investment as if it were your own. And that you needed to protect it. And that it really, really resonated with me, that idea. And I thought it was so important that, I mean, people entrust you with their money, and money is in many ways freedom. It is literally a material representation of freedom. And if people disagree, just try having a lot of money and then try having no money, and compare those two states, and you will see the defining feature of the delta between those two states is that like one was much freer than the other. You can get much freedom in your time, you get freedom of what you do and who you see and what you eat. It's just freedom. So when people entrust you with that, you have to be very careful, and you cannot be cavalier. And so that's where the name comes from. And the point of the fund is to allow us to deploy capital in the areas that we thought were very exciting and we're very interested about. And that's very, very early stage venture in Web3. We call it Web3 now because whatever. In crypto primitives. And the reason we like early stage is we really, really like to build with people. We find it very, very fun and interesting and both personally and economically rewarding to work on projects before there is a real product. Sometimes before there's even a real idea, sketching out the architecture, running a feasibility study, thinking about what it means to have a token, thinking about what a token is supposed to do, thinking about what kind of cryptographic primitives that we have today that we didn't have 5 years ago that enable us to do just these miraculous things. And perhaps we'll mention it later. For example, validity proofs or ZKPs in general. In their current form, they did not exist 5 years ago. The amount of stuff that you could do with them today on a practical level is it's amazing that we are here today relative to where we were 5 or 10 years ago. And it really excites us to try and like help people use these primitives to build novel, like either financial instruments, infrastructure, things that just don't exist. And the closer we are to that genesis of that idea, the more excited we are personally, and the more we think we have like edge, the more we think we are able to contribute. And it brings me to the second point that you asked, which is this idea of like non-technical VCs is how you call them, or non-technical capital allocators. I can't wrap my head around how one does this, how one allocates capital to the space or to any space. Forget crypto, forget Web3, without understanding it. I mean, the example is like I mean, did you watch Formula One? Or you're familiar with Formula One? You have teams that have a budget. I think it's like $150 million, or it's capped there, and then they have to like design the cars and design the engines and work with manufacturers and hire a driver and train the driver on the car. It's an extraordinarily sophisticated process for a race in which things are going hundreds of kilometers an hour. Now imagine I entrusted you with that responsibility. No, really, there's many analogies here. Imagine I entrusted you with that responsibility, and I came to you and I said, I need you to do a few things for me. First of all, I need you to like pick which car design is best, and then I need you to pick like the type of engine or like the configuration of the engine that works best. And not only do I need you to tell me that now, I need you to predict what's going to be the dominant type of engines 10 years from now. Adding to that, I also want you to tell me which features of the engine you think is most important, and then which are replaceable and which are not, and what advances are we going to get in like combustion technology that's going to like enable us to replace certain parts or modify certain parts, all of which is going to affect the performance of the car. And then you come to me and you say, what's an engine? How does it work? I'm like, fuck off, right? It's like, I mean, this is a completely useless conversation.
Yeah.
And now I'm asking you, hey, by the way, here's $100 million, or here's whatever, here's a certain amount of capital. Go deploy it into trying answering these questions. This would be completely foreign.
But that's what we've seen in the space.
That is what we've seen in the space to some degree. And to be fair, we've seen that in like other spaces as well. But somehow something about crypto, and perhaps it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's a very low barrier to entry space. So people can approach it however way they want. But it doesn't mean that you get to be cavalier. It doesn't mean that you get to be like, I don't want to use the word ignorance, because it's not ignorance. It's more just illiteracy. It's more just the content is there. This is like, for the most part, open source code. You can read it. And if you can't read it, if you're not inclined, or if you're not interested, you can get somebody else to read it. I mean, there are plenty of brilliant like software engineers and like programmers that can read this stuff. It's not particularly complicated. And the stuff is there. You can read it. You just have to read it.
Yeah.
Especially when you're entrusted with capital.
No, it is interesting. I think I spent too much time reading.
No such thing.
For a long time. I locked myself up and just read a bunch. And then I started going to some conferences. And I thought like the knowledge that I had was all kind of common knowledge. But I found out very quickly people did not know that much. And that the stuff that I thought was common knowledge was actually not very common at all. So it's been an interesting journey, just like talking with people in the space and the different people at the conferences.
But I think, so adding to that, I think it exists in some fashion on the founder side too. So I've spoken to enough founders to realize that that problem is pervasive, and that it might be equally dangerous. And the reason is, why choose build one primitive versus the other? Or why choose build on one network versus the other? Like, surely you have either like some economic hypothesis or some like technological hypothesis. But many times you talk to founders and they're like, I just sort of, it's path dependent. I just sort of stumbled in onto this and I decided to do it. Or, maybe there was a grant here, so I decided to work on this. And there's not enough thinking about the problem. There's always the immediate bias to jump towards the solution. Let me talk to you about the product. No, how about we talk about the problem from first principles, which is something you're very good at. How about we just break it down? First of all, ask ourselves what it is that we're trying to solve. Why is this particular network uniquely capable of supporting the solution? And what are the features of the solution that need to exist for this to actually address the problem? Because in many times we can be trying to solve a problem and realize that we're actually solving past the problem. We're solving something that's similar to, but not exactly related to the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
All of these things have to be at the forefront. They can't be, we'll figure it out when we write the fund deck, right? Or we'll figure it out when we write the deck for raising money if you're a founder. This has to be at the forefront. And iteration and like a heuristic approach to doing this is the way to get it wrong and get it wrong often and like repeat the process. There's no shame in that. That is how like innovation works. Not pick one thing, like, throw dots at a wall and like the one that sticks, we run with it. No. Be skeptical. Be skeptical of your own thinking. Be skeptical of what other people tell you, which again, something I think you're very good at, which is why I like hanging out with you a lot, is because we just get to do that a lot. We get to be very skeptical of ourselves and sometimes other people, and we get to learn that way.
For sure.
Right?
Maybe kind of like touching on like the founder side of things, especially now kind of with the Luna and the 3AC stuff kind of exploding. How have, from like the venture capital side and valuations, how have you kind of seen those like reset or kind of going forward after not only this, but maybe even like comment on just like how crazy things got like throughout like the past year and now kind of where they're at or where you think they're going to be going?
Sure. Let's just take a step back. Let's see where we were about a year ago today. We're in July of 2022. So a year ago today, we were in the middle of like the explosion of like layer 2s, the new L1s, so Avalanche, Solana. The NFT space was blowing up. I mean, this was just absolutely a carnival, just an absolute carnival of primitives. It was amazing. It was a tremendous amount of fun. But the speculation was rampant, absolutely rampant. And I still remember, because I remember the Avalanche work from a long time ago, from like 2018, 2019. And I remember thinking, wow, why are people excited about this now? And so I started to ask people like, do you know anything about Avalanche? Or, why are you so particularly, because I remember at some point, just people would not stop talking. And it is a wonderful network, and I'm a big fan. But I was curious why others were big fans, and nobody could articulate anything about it. So I was like, whoa, hold on, this doesn't make any sense. Like, is this like a counter bet on like maybe there's some aspect of Ethereum that you don't like, and so that's why you like Avalanche? Like, no. I'm like, so maybe so surely you've stumbled upon like Snowball and like how that consensus system works, and surely you're intrigued by that. What's Snowball? So a lot of these conversations, I'm like, so you've read the Ethereum roadmap, you've looked at like Gasper and you found this more interesting than that. They're like, what's Gasper? So it occurred to me then that even though the space had a lot of capital, at some point I think the market cap of the space was $2 or $3 trillion, which for a nascent space was a lot of money, and nobody could still articulate. So I was like, okay, we are clearly at the height of like like a speculative mania, or not at the height of it. Of course, I couldn't, and nobody else could tell you exactly where the top is, but you could tell at least that we were in surely some sort of like, frenzy. And I remember the private deals being done by then. It started with, maybe a year before that, a seed round valuation was a 1 at 10. One, you raise $1 million, you dilute yourself by 10%, you raise $1 million at a $10 million valuation. Very quickly became a 2 at 20. The 2 at 20 became the 3 at 30. And then the 3 at 30 became 4 at 40. And I think that's sort of where we stopped. We started getting a long tail of like really absurd pre-product, like all you had was a team that had some perhaps relevant, mostly irrelevant backgrounds in something else, come to the space and say, this is the idea that we have, 10-page slide deck. I'm raising it at $100 million valuation. And I'm just like, I'm just like, what? Like, how did we arrive at this valuation? I'll take $100 million valuation. I'll take $1 billion valuation, but walk me through. Please walk me through how you came up with it. And I'll be the first check-in. And I never got an answer then. And I still don't get an answer now. I just get lower numbers. I still get lower valuation. In fact, I was talking to someone the other day who's very like intellectually honest. And he told me like, 6 months ago, we were trying to raise at this valuation, exactly the same round, exactly the same terms. Now that with all that happened with like the public market and the secondary market, this is the valuation that we're trying to raise it now. And it's dramatically lower, right? So I told him, okay, so what is it that changed in the way you looked at your enterprise that caused you to change the valuation so much? He's like, the market tanked. I'm like, okay, that's great, but what are the prospects? Like, how did that change the prospects for your business? He said, no. You think about this wrong. It's not a science. It's an art. So I thought it was very humorous comment, but I also thought it reflected like the ethos of the market. In many ways, if we looked at like the venture market a year ago, people were upset about these valuations being bid up. You go to a private round and it starts off raising maybe at $20 or $30 million. It gets interest from some investors, and then some investors want to allocate a lot more capital. So there's no way to maintain the dilution except by increasing the valuation. So people would bid up these rounds. And if you think about these private investments as nothing more than just a product, there's a supply and demand for, a scarcity of this product with a high demand from the like a capital inflow perspective will mean that the price of these things will go up. So that's what happened. Now that the cost of capital has gone up, and this is more macro, as less to do with the crypto space, and there is less liquidity and there's less demand chasing it, we shouldn't be surprised that the valuations are going down. The price of these things are also going down. But I have still not seen, either a year ago, 2 years ago, or today, like simple reasoning about how one values a network, or not even a network, how somebody values like a company that's built, like behaves like a SaaS company on blockchain. It does a service, it has employees, it has a balance sheet, it has a P&L, and it's doing a service for someone. Like a good example of this is like all of these staking providers. I mean, they're really just good old like businesses with a simple cash flow stream that you can model. And the pervasive way in which people evaluate these deals and like value these enterprises is not very scientific. And I still find that surprising. But here's where we are today. And I think there is a return of like to sanity. I think there's enough informed investors in the space that are able to come back and say, okay, we had to deploy capital at some point, and maybe we weren't happy with these valuations, but we had to have some sort of exposure, or maybe we introduced a new mandate for exposure. So we just sort of, we held our nose and we went in. Now we have a little bit more time, a little bit more space, maybe even a little bit less capital, but we have time to think about these deals and maybe think about how we structure them. First of all, if you look at how like crypto venture deals are structured, they're very strange. If you take like a term sheet for like for like a new L1 and then like the SAFT or the warrants that come with them or whatever, and you show that to someone from like Silicon Valley, or you showed it to like any I won't mention names, any of those guys, they will look at you and be like, this is bizarre. What kind of terms are you guys doing here? What kind of hustle is this, right? The terms are so different because like the business prospects are very different. Like in one case, you're trying to launch a network, and perhaps this network has a token, and this token is valued in some odd way, and it's distributed in some way very unlike what you would have in terms of like a liquidity event for like traditional equity. So even the structure of these deals are very, very different in crypto. But I think we will see a little bit more sanity, and I think we will see a little bit more traditional terms come to these deals.
And I also think it's good for founders in the long term. I mean, because if you raise at these crazy valuations and ultimately your product does not meet those expectations, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because when you need to raise capital again, it's just a much lower valuation. So I honestly think it's healthier for the entire ecosystem. But no, it's interesting to kind of get your take on it. Maybe to pivot a little bit from the conversation into some of the more technical sides. You and I talk a lot about blockchains and blockchain scaling. I think you have a very unique perspective just with your background in the PhD and the math side on how some of these things work. So maybe like touch upon like your thoughts more broadly on layer twos and kind of how you think those will fit into blockchain ecosystem going forward.
Sure. So this idea of a layer two is like very qualitatively, it's as follows. We have a network, we'll call that the layer one. That could be Ethereum, that could be Solana, that could be Avalanche, that could be whatever. And the network is optimized for a certain type of behavior. It has a consensus mechanism. It has a certain number of nodes, or like an optimal target for the number of nodes. It has a certain block size. All of these parameters that go into running a network. And it happens to be that the network is suited for not all functions, but a subset of functions. There are certain things that a network can do very well. An example of this would be like we talk about Bitcoin. It's very, very good at being decentralized and like securely transferring coins between one wallet to the other. Solana has very high throughput. It does that very, very well, perhaps at the expense of other things, right? Ethereum, for example, is a very decentralized state transition machine that allows people to like. It brought on this paradigm of like composable programming, this idea that smart contracts, you can write them, they can be autonomous, they can execute by themselves, and they can interact with each other, they can share state, all of these sort of ideas. But it's suboptimal in many other ways. For example, Solana and Ethereum optimize for completely different functions. And the fact that we talk about them in the same breath is, I mean, it's like talking about sports. It's like saying, basketball and football are related. I mean, they're sports, but they do very different things.
Yeah.
So there came the idea, okay, I have a layer one that optimizes for certain functions, but I want it to do other things. Certain types of transactions with a certain frequency, with a certain latency, with a certain like variable level of security, for example. So can I start moving the execution burden, the communication burden, maybe even the data storage burden? Can I start moving these things off chain? And the word off chain just means not on the L1. I'm somehow outsourcing this to somebody else that in some way is related, is tied back to the network. And people say that L2s they're tied to the network in the sense that every once in a while they have to settle back to the layer one. Somehow they inherit the security of the L1. That's how people like to talk about it. And the paradigm that started initially was with like distributed ledgers is let's do as much as possible on chain. Let's store everything on chain. Let's calculate everything on chain. Let's communicate with each other all on chain, which works great when you have like 1,000 users. The second you start scaling to millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of users, you realize that the majority of these networks were not designed to handle that sort of throughput. And instead, the new paradigm is, well, how can I start moving things off chain? How can I, without going back to square one? Square one is having a centralized operator, asking them to update the state for me, trusting them that they will update the state correctly. I have no way to know whether they did it or not. I mean, if you go to a bank today, that's essentially how it works. You sort of give them your money. You assume that they protect it. I'm assuming you don't like monitor your checking account balance every single second. They could change it and you would not be privy to it. And they could change it simultaneously in a way that like you wouldn't be privy to it. So, and you just have to trust them. There's an element of trust. But what if I tell you, and that's not me, what if somebody could come tell you, I can bring back that element of centralization, which might sound like, ooh, what are we doing here? Without trust, right? I might actually get the performance of something that behaves maybe as a smaller centralized entity as opposed to like a very decentralized network. But I maintain some aspect of the trustlessness. And that's when like the two flavors of like L2s come in, like fraud proofs and validity proofs, right? And people refer to like optimistic rollups, things like arbitrum, optimism. They use fraud proofs to achieve this type of layer 2, and then ZK rollups, or people call them that. They're really validity rollups that use validity proofs, and I make the distinction because you don't have to have like a zero knowledge aspect in a validity proof. In fact, like the Starks and Snarks, which is like the primitive that are used for these validity proofs, they don't necessarily guarantee like zero knowledge. So it's just more accurate to talk about validity proofs. But they come in two flavors, like I mentioned. One is optimistic, which assumes the following. It says, hey, I'm going to outsource a lot of these calculations. So people are going to, instead of submitting all of these transactions on chain one by one, I'm just going to submit them off chain to this operator who's going to batch them for me. He's going to send it to like a sequencer. And they're going to compress these transactions, which, by the way, you could do in any way you'd like, including using Snarks and Starks. I've heard people discuss this idea that like Starks are only for validity proofs. That's not true. You can actually generate fraud proofs with like Starks and Snarks, but it's a minor detail. You generate like a proof, which is just a compressed version of an attestation to something. You say these 1,000 transactions that would have normally been submitted on chain. Here's like a compressed proof that they happened, and I'm going to submit them on chain. And in an optimistic setup, and that's where it gets its name, everybody assumes that you're not lying to them. Everybody assumes that you're honest, but they're watching you. And they're called watchers or sentinels or fishermen. I forget the exact terminology. But people are sitting there in like a glass room watching you make these little proofs and submitting them on chain, these proposed blocks on chain. And they are incentivized to catch you if you start to like mess around, if you misbehave, or if you start presenting false information, or if you're acting in a way that's fraudulent. Somebody's going to raise a flag and say, I think you're messing around. And here is a fraud proof. That's where it gets its name from. Here's a proof that you are committing fraud. And then everybody goes back and then recalculates the state transition and in front of everyone and says, there's an arbitration. There's a time period for arbitration. And a jury of your peers says, aha, one of you was wrong. One of you was correct. The person who was wrong gets their stake. They have to bond a stake to be able to do this, gets their stake slashed. But there's a few good things about the way this is done. And there's also a few things that are not so good. The good things is actually the optimistic nature of it is probably the most important and defining feature. What that means is you can actually get a lot of throughput and a lot more performance by assuming that everyone is behaving properly. Because that means is you only have to produce these proofs, these fraud proofs. You only have to produce them when somebody suspects like malpractice. Somebody suspects somebody is being fraudulent. But in general, you don't actually produce them. So for the most part, people are just sitting there submitting transactions off chain. They're being compressed. They're being submitted on chain, and they're cheaper and they're faster than what's happening at the L1. And every once in a while, you set an L1 and you get lower gas costs and you get high performance. Great. But the problem is what happens when I want to leave the system? And there's this idea of like withdrawal delay. And because of the optimistic nature of the system, and because you need a jury of your peers to check like who was misbehaving and who was not, there is like a natural like latency or period which people have to wait for people to produce the proofs, and then for people to come in and check these proofs and to arbitrate between them. So if you wanted to forever live on the L2, perhaps that's not a big deal. But if at some point, and you need to, because that's where the security aspect comes in, settle back to the L1 and withdraw some of your funds to the L1, then there is this like structural delay. Another thing is if the applications that you deploy on the L2 tend to be very, very like data intensive. So if you need to like, let's say some application, you need like a lot of financial data, you need the weather data, you need like a ton of like different data points that are going to be made available. And remember, for these fraud proofs to be produced, all of the data that you used for the batching and to generate the proofs have to exist on chain. There has to be a native like data availability layer there. Else, how would one be able to like generate a fraud proof? If you don't give me the data, you say, by the way, here are the new transactions. Trust me, there's no way I can generate a fraud proof. So by definition, these optimistic systems have to have that data available. And if that data is very rich, that's quite burdensome. So these are sort of like the kind of trade-offs that you get. And the leaders in the space have to, of course, be like Arbitrum and Optimism, which people have followed for some time. And they are making real strides in the space, but I think it's still very, very nascent. But the one question that comes with the L2s is there enough applications to even like require all of this work on the L2s? And I don't know if I have the answer to that.
Not yet.
Not yet. If you look at a lot of the L2s, the blocks are mostly empty.
Yeah.
Right? But to not skip the one that I have a bias towards, because I think it's mathematically elegant and I think it makes a lot of sense. Validity proofs is the other way is the other flavor of these L2s, and they require a completely different set of assumptions. They are sort of, if we called like fraud proofs or like optimistic L2s, then we'll call the validity proofs pessimistic. They assume by default that everything is false, and the only allowable state transitions are ones that are presented with a proof. So here comes the funny bit, and here comes the reason why perhaps the optimistic and validity proof crowds, they can compete. It comes from the fact that you assume that every single submission that occurs in an optimistic system is true, and only once in a while do you have to submit a fraud proof. The opposite is true with validity proofs. For every single proposed state transition, you have to produce a proof. So it means you're generating proofs all the time.
Do you think over the long term, fraud proofs remain, or and it's only validity proofs, or do you think they'll both be used in tandem? I'm curious about this.
I do think they lie on a spectrum, and I'm not trying to cop out, but I do think the user has a lot more say than you and I. The user can decide what kind of assumptions they're comfortable with, what kind of costs they're comfortable with. I personally think that ZK eats all, or like validity proofs eats all, that everything can be enshrined in that framework. Yeah. Everything can be done in that way. But I do think there is a room. I mean, the validity proofs that we have today are still extremely nascent. I mean, we're still running a single Starkware, which is the company that developed StarkNet and StarkX. They're the only ones running a prover. Running it is it's still actually closed source. Like nobody outside has the open source code to run these provers. That's how early it is. So having an intermediary, something like an optimistic system, something like what Arbitrum and Optimus do, is very valuable. Now, do I think that and it's one thing I forgot to touch upon, do I think that they are there forever? I don't think so. And here's why. Another fundamental difference between both these systems is the lockup of capital, the capital efficiency. To behave as a person who batches these transactions or anything is going on chain, and you submit it to a sequencer, and then they sort of submit it on chain as a proposed block, you have to bond a certain amount of tokens, a certain amount of capital that prevents you from misbehaving. Because like we said, at some point, if there's an arbitration and it turns out that you're wrong, you're slashed. And if the person who is accusing you of being wrong turns out to be wrong, they're slashed.
And this is all on the optimistic side.
This is all on the optimistic side. There's no bonds at stake in validity proofs at all. Because you're not required to trust anyone. These are fundamentally like they attest to computational integrity, and you don't need to put a bond in case that you are wrong. You can't be wrong. You can't be mischievous. But the problem is, and I'll steal another comment from Kevin, who was on the same podcast with Shahram. Kevin from Avalaz. I share exactly the same philosophy as he does, which is I completely think that a proof of stake system works and it's fantastic, and in principle it really does. There is like a non-zero amount, a positive non-zero amount of stake that or a distribution of stakes that people can put up that can cause them to behave optimally. I think finding that distribution of stakes is practically almost impossible, or that it requires extremely sophisticated mathematical modeling that I haven't seen. And so deciding what amount of stake is good enough, it runs into the same problem as proof of stake systems in general, which in general mean that I assume that you are economically incentivized to behave well. And the way I guarantee this is by making sure that if you behave well, you're rewarded. And if you don't behave well, you are penalized.
Yeah.
I think the penalty by default should be the opportunity cost. But trying to introduce a slashing mechanism is, again, in principle, a wonderful idea. And I'm not contesting it. But I am contesting the practical implementation. It is extremely difficult. And by the way, I don't think there is, even on Ethereum, for example, you have to post, and in the POS version, you have to post 32 ETH, for example, to be validated. Well, how did we come up with 32? I mean, I know in the past, like it's a technically inherited for in order not to overwhelm the network at the time. That's how that number came. But first of all, that number surely has to be dynamic, and surely it's very, very difficult to optimize for multiple things at the same time. In one case, they were optimizing for the bandwidth of the network. They were not optimizing for the economic behavior of the agents. But we're talking about an economic system. Optimistic rollups are economic systems at the end of the day. And so I just find it very, very difficult to believe that like we have just come up with these systems and this is the number that we have to, this is the number of bond or capital that you have to stake, and that's how we're going to do it. So I just, by default, I find it easier to think of a world in which we have like validity proofs.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think kind of the optimistic side is kind of a stopgap until we have more robust validity proofs. I am optimistic over the long term. Once these block spaces get saturated, we'll start to use them more. But
and to be fair, like we haven't even given validity proofs even like a real like honest shot. Like the libraries that we use today, the Cairo implementation that we have for StarkNet and StarkX, like this stuff did not exist 5 years ago. Like I'll tell you a funny story. That's personal. I was my brother who studied computer science in the 90s. We were in a car together once in the past year, and I was on the phone. I was talking to someone, and we were talking about ZKPs. I was just mentioning the idea of ZKPs. We were talking about some roll up, whatever, and I mentioned I used the word ZKP. And at the end of the call, we were still in the car, and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, what did you mean by ZKP? Surely you didn't mean like zero knowledge proofs." I said, "No, that's exactly what I meant. That's what we were talking about." He said, "Huh. Like these people use this now?" And I said, "What do you mean?" "Yeah, of course." He said, "Well, when I was a student in the 90s, if you're studying computer science then, our professors, they would tell us about all of these wonderful mathematical constructs. And at the end of the lecture, they would say, by the way, this is completely impractical. Like it would take us millions of years to generate these proofs. Just forget about it. Like it's a beautiful mathematical curiosity, but we'll never see it in our lifetimes."
Yeah.
I guess they meant by lifetimes like 20 years. Because 20 years later, here we are.
Yeah.
Completely practical. Like for the most part practical. So this is where we are. So we have people who, or not people in general, like the critiques of validity proofs. I don't think they're certainly they're helpful from a technical side, but I don't think they even give validity proofs a fair shot. We've not even been a few years in.
Yeah.
The Cairo white paper, for Christ's sake, was like a year old. It's not even a year old.
So maybe going off this, talk more or like kind of getting more into like Starkware and zero knowledge proofs and why you think they're so interesting, especially coming from like the math PhD background, why they're so fascinating. One, from like the technical aspect, mathematical point of view, but also how they're applicable to blockchains and how they'll be used kind of going forward.
Sure. So the one disclaimer I'll say about like zero knowledge tech in general, it has nothing to do with blockchain. Like the idea of a zero knowledge proof or a validity proof, somebody attesting to, so here, okay, let's make the distinction. A validity proof is the ability for me to solve a mathematical problem and demonstrate to you or prove to you, hence the name, that I've solved this mathematical problem without you having to re-execute exactly the same amount of computation that I did in order to arrive at that solution, because that would be moot. If I asked you, and I'll give you a simple example, if I asked you what the solution to a polynomial equation is, and let's say for simplicity, let's say it's quadratic, so it's squared, the highest power is x squared, and you come to me and say, "Omar, hey, this is a mathematical equation, this is a quadratic polynomial, and I know the roots of this equation, I know the solution to this equation." One way to show me that you know the solution of this equation is to actually tell me what the solutions are. Another way is to tell me, listen, instead of showing you how I like solve this problem using like the quadratic formula or however way you solved it, or like the intersection of lines or whatever, let me just show you that I know I can factor the problem, a polynomial, into like the product of into two products of a polynomial A and polynomial B, both of first order. And I know it's of the form x minus A product x minus B is equal to 0. And I can prove to you that I know the value of the constants A and B are the solutions to the polynomial, because this exact equation for all values of A and B will exactly evaluate to 0. Aha. So you've demonstrated to me that you know the solution, but you didn't have to walk me through the entire detail. And it's not as complicated to verify. The same is true with like much more difficult polynomials. Let's say 7th order or 8th order. It turns out these polynomials, there's a beautiful theorem of mathematics that shows that like you can't actually like write them down in closed forms. You have to solve them using a computer or using a calculator. And if you had to like prove to me that, or if I had to like check whether your answer is true and I had to actually solve the equation, it would require me to have a computer and like relatively sophisticated understanding of like how to solve a polynomial equation, which I don't. I just take the numbers that you give me and I just like plug them into this equation, and it always evaluates to 0. I'm like, aha. So this is the idea of a validity proof, that you can demonstrate to me after doing a lot of hard work that you solved the solution, and I can verify that is truly the solution in a relatively simple way. Now, the zero knowledge aspect of that is one more layer. It's that I can do that without even revealing what the answers are at all, or betraying anything about the answer. And the famous example that people give, which I like a lot, is like the Alibaba cave problem, in which there is a cave, and that cave is, have you heard of this one?
No.
Okay, well this is my favorite. Some people use like the 3-color problem, other different type of examples. This one I think is the most intuitive. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. There's a cave that's partitioned in the middle with a metal door, and that metal door has like a keypad, which you have to input a 4-digit password, and it lets you in. If it's correct, the door opens, and you go to the other side. And it's in a circle. So if we both stand at the entrance of this circle, and the cave is on one end, the partition door is on the other side, the only way for you to come do full circle and see me again is if you go through that door. I know that if I saw you, you must have gone through that door. There's no other physical way for you to get in. So I tell you, show me that you know the password. Show me that you know the password that you need to put in the keypad that unlocks this door. You say, okay, there's 2 ways for me to do this. One, I can just tell you the password, and you can go and you can try for yourself, and it'll open. That's not interesting, because then I betrayed to you what the password is. What if there was a way for me to actually demonstrate to you with vanishingly small probability that I'm not lying, and but without actually telling what the password is? So you say, okay, I'll say, okay, I'm all ears, show me. You say, okay, you and I will stand here right at the door, pick a direction. You remember, you can traverse the circle counterclockwise or clockwise. You say, pick a direction and don't tell me what it is. In fact, write down on a piece of paper and don't show it to me. Write down 10 different directions sequentially, and I will show you every single time. You say, go counterclockwise twice, then one clockwise, then twice counterclockwise, then 3 times clockwise. And every single time I will appear at the other side. So surely I must know the answer. And if I do this enough times, probabilistically with like asymptotically converging probability, I can't be lying to you. And so that's exactly how these work. Now, the one thing that's slightly different is that this is like an interactive proof, in a way that like I have to tell you each time, and I can't give you the list beforehand, because then you can sort of fake it. You can go on one side, you can wait until I look away, and then you can go to the other side, and then you can go back. That's sort of, so you can't really know the list up front. It has to be sort of encrypted, or you don't know it. And this idea of making this proof non-interactive. And how do you make it non-interactive? There's this famous idea in cryptography known as the Fiat-Shamir heuristic. And instead of me sending you like a list, or like randomly asking you to like do stuff for me, I use hash functions, or like hashes of like Merkle roots that like you can actually use the environment around you to get a source of randomness without having to talk to me. And it makes we don't have to communicate with each other. I can just talk to you once, and you can go and do your own thing, and you can prove to me that you in fact do know this thing, and we don't have to talk to each other. It's non-interactive. But that's sort of the idea. And the reason we got into all of this was because I wanted to demonstrate that it had nothing to do with blockchains. It could be interesting for blockchains, but it could be interesting for a lot of other things, including, suppose somebody had to do a very sophisticated calculation using like a cluster of supercomputers that nobody else in the world has access to, that it's practically impossible for anyone to even verify that you were even like being truthful, or these, not just truthful, but these calculations were done correctly. And one way to do it is using a validity proof. You say, here is the list of outputs that you asked for me, and you paid me money for the CPU hours or whatever for me to do this work for you. And here is a small proof that I did this correctly. And you don't have to trust the operator. You can trust the integrity of the maths. And that is the great paradigm.
And a lot of this, I mean, as you said, is kind of really kind of got turbocharged by blockchains just because there's so much money in the blockchain ecosystem. A lot more money has kind of been thrown at advancing this research and bringing it back to the forefront to use blockchain, or to help scale blockchains but it's definitely interesting kind of how it's progressed like over the last like 10 years or so.
Well, in many ways, it was the question: how do I behave in like a Byzantine system, and how do I guarantee like consensus in a Byzantine style system? And that means that like it is possible for us to like behave, but it's also possible for us to lie to each other in a certain setting.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that like trying to build like a truly Byzantine fault tolerant system is very computationally intensive. And like if you try and do it anywhere outside the lab, where we're talking about like a few thousands of users, 10,000 users with like tens of validators, it's prohibitive. So there has to be a way for me to like decouple like trust and verification and move a lot of this off chain while maintaining sort of fault tolerance. And that's literally the purview of cryptography. It allows you to do things without revealing certain information, or it allows you to trust maths as opposed to trusting people. So like I think the end game is trust, but it's not trusting the operator, it's not trusting the agent, it's not trusting the game theoretic incentives, it's trusting the maths.
For sure. Out of all of that, and like the unique properties of validity proofs and zero knowledge proofs, what are you most excited for in like the application of like blockchains?
I think besides the L2 space that we talked about, which is in many ways uniquely enabled by validity proofs, this idea that has come up recently of like application specific chains. This idea that you can run one chain that is optimized to do one thing. Let's say it's, trading assets or minting NFTs or playing a game or whatever. We know from like general purpose computing that like in general, having a very specific environment that is optimized to do one thing and one thing only is more performant and is cheaper than having like a general purpose system. So is there a way using these validity proofs to like scale fractally? And I know you don't like that word, but this idea of fractal scaling, this idea that like I can have a general all-purpose base layer. Let's call that StarkNet. Let's call that the layer 2. And I can actually build application-specific chains on it.
So layer 3.
Layer 3. You said it, not me. You said it, not me.
Layer 3. So let's get into layer 3s. What are your thoughts, pros and cons, and why you think they're interesting?
Okay, so let's first define a layer 2 from the perspective of like the operators. You have in any validity proof system, you have essentially two agents: the verifier and the prover. So the verifier contract always exists on the base layer. It exists on let's say Ethereum. The prover exists off chain. Okay, the idea is that the prover sends the proof on chain, submits it on chain. It is executed in a way that's exponentially cheaper than it is to generate the proof. That's sort of the purpose of these like succinct systems. And it binary yes, no. This state transition is either true, or if it's false, it never makes its way on chain. Literally by virtue of submitting that proof on chain, it must mean that it's true, assuming that the implementation is done correctly. Now, what if I tell you that, okay, let's move the verifier contract to layer 2. Let's, instead of having the verifier contract on layer 1, let's actually post it on layer 2 and have the verifications done on layer 2. Is it possible to like recursively submit these proofs? So now I have this idea of a recursive proof, a proof that's submitted from the L3 to the L2. That's then another proof is generated for that combination, and then that's submitted to the L1. And you're going to ask, well, what's the point of that? Or what's the benefit and what's the drawback? Well, the benefit of that is you can literally magnify like these types of like scaling. You can actually compress if the transition from layer 2 to layer 1 gives you 1,000x compression, and literally in terms of size. And then a layer 3 to layer 2 gives you another 1,000x. You can actually compress like what you were doing at the layer 3 down to layer 1 by a factor of 1,000,000, which is extraordinary. And you're limited only by reason. You could literally do this recursively. It's actually not like there's no hardware requirements. You can, the cost of generating these proofs, at least in the Stark framework, is actually only like roughly logarithmic in terms of like the size of the proof, which actually means you can like make the proof a lot larger without having to incur that much cost. So it's actually not even a hardware problem, because I remember I had a discussion with someone who they were asserting that you run into limitations that way. You actually don't. It scales very, very well. You can do a layer 3, a 4, a layer 10 if you wanted to. It would not cost that much more. That's the beauty of like logarithmic functions. But you're limited by common sense. And that is, at some point you get enough, if you've reduced if you've reduced the gas cost from a few dollars per transaction to one millionth of a dollar per transaction, at some point you're like, okay, it's probably not worth the opportunity cost to like essentially build an extra n+1 layer, right? At some point, it's good enough. It's good enough. So that's really where it stops. And the one argument, and that actually holds true also for optimistic systems as well, is how do you get cross rollup or cross L3 or cross L2 interoperability, right? You have these sort of silo chains, and each of them does something, and some of them might store their data, some of them might not store their data. I need them to interact with each other. And this is annoying to do because they're not sharing the same state, because at least the same temporary state. And my answer to that is, well, and hence recursive proofs, hence moving to a layer 3 and not a layer 2, because all of a sudden you now have to bridge. Remember, all the layer 2s, they talk to each other, they bridge through the L1.
Yes.
Right? So what if I say, well, they bridge to each other through the L2s? It's actually much faster and much cheaper as well. So there is a method to the madness. It's not just let's try and see what happens. If you design them in such a way where you can have certain guarantees, and for certain applications, maybe you're not so interested in data availability, maybe not everything has to be posted on chain. There is a world in which these things are actually very, very composable by using these recursion proofs.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, like in theory, and I get like the data compression and like reducing gas costs. My like biggest thing, and I think we've kind of seen it, like on at least from the L1 standpoint, there's just not very many users yet. I mean, I think that's a variety of factors, but I think just how people have kind of become accustomed to like the Web 2 type experience, we need to make it as cheap and as fast as possible. And so my only qualm today with like L3s or like even L2s for some standpoint is like, what is the latency introduced when you keep doing these data compressions? And then ultimately, the latency, but like when is the transaction actually final? And I think like, because a lot of this like, or once we start adding all these like different complexities, we're kind of throwing it on the users, and the users don't like understand any of it. So I'm just curious, like over the long term, to kind of see how it will unfold. But yeah, I don't know. I am curious.
Well, to answer one question that's very easy to answer, when is a transaction final? When it makes it to the L1, and even then it might not be final depending on the type of consensus that you have. But let's say you assume like one block, once it makes it into the chain, that's it. Sort of how Avalanche does it, it's final. Once it makes it there, that's final. Beyond that, it's still not final. It's still a proposed block. You're a fan of parallelization, and and we know a chain which will not be named, which is wonderful. That uses that as like the native primitive, the native idea is to parallelize a lot of the execution, so long as like the state is not shared or there's no sort of overlap. You can execute things in parallel. So can you with these L3s. So can you with these provers. Suppose instead of using, I mean, that's how like Cairo works, or how Stocknet works today. They have a sharp or a shared prover. There's one prover that everybody can submit transactions to for multiple applications, and it sort of goes together and generates proof. But you can have multiple sharps, and you can also have like dedicated provers that all execute or all produce these proofs for different L3s in parallel. You don't actually have to wait. And then they can be aggregated on an L2, for example, and be submitted once at some frequency to the L1. So you can actually get parallel-like behavior using these like recursive stacks or these recursive proofs. So in many ways, like I don't think latency will be a problem at the L2 or L3 level. And we're literally just scratching the surface on the hardware for provers.
Yeah.
Whether it's ASIC style, FPGAs, we've literally not even like scratched the surface. And I have no doubt in the same way that 10 years ago, in the same way that we have a Moore's law for general computation and for general, the number of transistors on a diode and whatnot. The same will be true for provers. And so I think it's really just a matter of time, and latency will not be the issue for these types of systems.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm curious to kind of see how it plays over the long term. maybe to kind of stick on this scaling topic, the industry today has kind of started to move towards more modular architecture versus, say, like monolithic of like Bitcoin or Ethereum. How do you kind of see these two kind of playing out over the long term, or what do you think is like more optimal architecture for these blockchains?
So this one's a bit more nuanced, and also part of it is I have not studied every single possible combination of like a modular blockchain versus like a monolithic blockchain, because to give you like a fair answer, because there are combinations of modular blockchains that might work better than certain monolithic blockchains. But just to say all modular blockchains will be superior to monolithic blockchains is nonsense. And the same is true the other way around. I do have one qualm, however, with this general idea of like modularity. Everything could be separated out. You can separate out settlement, execution, data availability, whatever. If you assume that there is a scenario in which data is not available, or like that is violated somehow because of a dishonest majority, that doesn't just threaten the data availability layer. That actually threatens the consensus layer. That threatens the actual blockchain. So there's a lot that goes out of the window if we start assuming that we're designing for a world in which we need everything to be modular. In many ways, we're designing for a world that doesn't exist. We're designing for a world in which consensus on the L1 is subverted, and we have to resort to some sort of like recourse with data availability. So I just don't think there's enough thought that went into what the Venn diagram of assumptions are with like a monolithic L1 and like a modular L1. And what happens when, as soon as I start to detach these different functions from an L1 and have them become modular, the second I start worrying about when these are like, for example, when data is available, the second I start to have generate proofs for that, this is like the least of my worries. I should really be worrying about, well, what happens to my consensus? So in many ways, I think that it will be the dominant paradigm. I am again of the opinion that trying to optimize as much as possible on the monolithic serial, even L1, before worrying about like trying to optimize either using parallelization or either using modularity. There's a lot that could be done on the L1. And what we don't think about, we think about the outputs or the gains that we're going to get from introducing a modular architecture. But what we don't think about is the sheer enormity of the task that has to go through. That we have to take care of latency, that we have to make sure that like no security violations occur, that we have to make sure that all these systems communicate together. Like there's a lot that goes in from a practical perspective, and in many ways, I'll resort back to what I said about like proof of stake and optimistic systems and proof of stake systems in general. Like in theory, I think it might be a great idea, but in practice, I think there's a lot more that we're going to have to worry about if these assumptions are violated when it comes to modularity.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's an interesting point of view to attack, but I'm curious, and all these blockchains, I think like they'll all work. It's just to what degree and what problem are they actually solving, and then from an engineering and user standpoint, which one works the best.
And there are a lot of ways to like data is not an issue. We have like storing data somewhere is not the problem that we run into like today. We are the throughput bottlenecks is the paradigm that we're trying to solve, and how to do like distributed consensus and decentralized computation in general in a way that's very cheap. It is not where do we store this data. There are ways to store the data, and there are ways to do it securely, and there are ways to incentivize people to do it. It's not a big deal. And there are ways to optimize, like I said, to optimize the L1 and to optimize the monolithic layer well before we even worry about like modularity.
Yeah, so that's where I was kind of going. I fully agree. Like we haven't even really explored the limits of a modular L1 and how far we can push of a monolithic L1 and how far we can push that before even trying to do these different things like sharding or whatever different scaling solutions. And so I appreciate that some blockchains are taking the approach to do that. and see how hard you can actually push that before trying these different avenues.
That's right.
Awesome, man. Well, maybe like, I'm curious, we've been chatting for about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
I'm curious though, maybe before we sign off, what are kind of like any spicy takes or things that you would say are contentious in the space that you hold near and dear to your heart?
Things that are spicy. I have a lot of spicy takes. I mean,
let's hear them. Do a spicy data dump.
If you look at DeFi today, the majority of primitives on there, the financial primitives that were built, are objectively inferior to what we have in like traditional finance. Like you wouldn't, if you were at a bank or if you were at a trading firm, you would never touch this stuff. It is so inferior. It's not even worth your time. It is laughable to some of these people. It is. And we've not even crossed that, like, we're not even close.
Is that because of the underlying L1 or just the actual application that is being built is just inferior?
I think both.
Okay.
I think the underlying L1 is not performant. And the primitives that are built on there, they're replicas. They're inferior digital replicas of what we already have, right? And you see a lot of this in the space. And you don't want to be like a party, but we don't want to be just everything you see like, oh, this sucks. Oh, we have something better. But you just have to be critical and you have to be objective and you have to be like, listen, if the whole point of the whole premise is to like revolutionize the way we transact with each other and like change the way markets are structured and change the way people like send money to each other, we have to do better from a technological perspective and from a theoretical perspective as well. You can't come to me and say, hey, I'm proposing this money market or I'm proposing this like DEX or whatever. And it's using like, rudimentary mathematics that like it in many ways is like structurally flawed in that it's subject to like, very clear ways you can front run the stuff, very clear ways you can, adverse selection, you can, toxic flow, or trade against these things. And this is like, you don't need to build these systems to like recognize these things. But there's also been like very good work describing why some of these systems may or may not work. Shout out to the guys at Gauntlet who do wonderful research and they've shown like what the limits of these systems are and what the edge cases actually that these systems might be useful for. But I think that's where we are today. We are at the point of edge cases. We may have a point, 2 or 3 points of contention where we say, hey, maybe this in 5 or 10 years, maybe this becomes better. But the majority of what we've built or what has been built today is useless. And it's not useless in the sense that we didn't learn anything from it, but we can't use it as a primitive. We literally cannot use it. And the other side of that coin or token is the tokenomics, okay? We've had the era of central banking started in about 1910s is when we've had like the modern form of the central bank. And we've spent about 100 years, maybe 110 years, people are trying to figure out monetary economics. And we've thrown the finest economic minds, if there are such a thing, I'm kidding, at these problems. And we've yet to come with like simple models for how to model the economy, the behavior of agents in the economy, and how to like develop ex ante a system that by monetary expansion and monetary contraction, we can like incentivize people to behave in a certain way and maintain stable unemployment and stable price levels, which is sort of like the mandate of the Federal Reserve, at least, which is sort of the de facto central bank of the United States. We've not gotten there yet. So to expect people that are like casually producing these like tokenomic systems to get this right is absurd. It's completely absurd.
Yeah.
And to say that like, oh, but we have these tokens and they do this. Our tokens do very little. The tokens that in like we have today are we haven't even lived like one cycle of tokenomics. Most of these tokens, like let's say they vest over the emissions occurs either ad infinitum or 5, 6, 7 years when the majority of supply comes on. We haven't even gone through that cycle yet. So I think besides the financial primitives, the tokenomics, the tokenomic models that we have today are completely and utterly absurd and need to be like changed from first principles. And the fact that today, like you can't even you have to ask people, tell me one example of like a tokenomic system that you do like, as opposed to one that you don't like. The majority of them don't work. And the ones that work don't behave in the way that as we're designed. And we're not even sure they might work now. I mean, in many cases, if you look at like, I don't want to like throw dirt, but if you look at like some of these games that had, people were pointing to these as miraculous tokenomic systems that are going to change the future of France. These tokenomic systems, and lo and behold, 6 months later, right? I mean, the whole thing shambolic. So it's the same thing. We haven't even tried out these tokenomic systems, and we haven't given them enough thought. And surely the most interesting thing in Web3, in addition to the fact that it's this, we can have these decentralized primitives, is the fact that we can use a token incentive in addition to the normal economic incentive of any enterprise to incentivize users to behave in a way they would otherwise not behave. We have yet to even scratch the surface on that. And so I think people that attest to tokenomics, and people talk about DeFi primitives and DeFi because I think it's the most mature one. I think we are nowhere near. So my those are maybe spicy takes, I guess.
I like it.
I don't know.
I like it. Well, really appreciate your time, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to enjoy this podcast. But no, thank you, and super happy we met in New York, and happy to call you a friend. Thank you.
The pleasure and distinction is all mine. Thank you for spending the time with me. Thank you for this beautiful day, beautiful podcast. Shout out to Dean. Where is Dean? He's not here. But maybe our friend Dean Krause, who is very kind enough to host us here, he was supposed to come on just to say hi,
make a quick cameo,
but
he'll get his own podcast.
He'll get his own.
You can show up and get some limelight.
Yeah, we'll find him. So again, thank you for your intellectual prowess. Thank you for keeping me intellectually honest. Sometimes I say things you're that doesn't make any sense. You have to explain it to me more. Then I might be wrong. But yeah,
likewise.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you.